chain. Now, I know you may have been confused with the electron transport chain in photosynthesis, but hopefully it will start sticking a little bit more as we go through it with respiration. Electron transport chain consists of a series of proteins that are embedded in the inner membrane cristae of the mitochondria. So similar process, different membrane. So this one's mitochondria, not chloroplast. So keep in mind we have two different organelles. The chloroplast is in plants, that's generating the glucose, changing our sunlight to chemical energy. In respiration, the mitochondria is taking that chemical energy from the foods that we eat and turning it into ATP that we can use. So in prokaryotic cells, the electron transport chain lies along the cell membrane. We already mentioned that because it doesn't have a mitochondria. So just remember back to what we talked about with that. In this last stage of aerobic respiration, the NADH and the FADH2 are going to release hydrogen atoms, which are going to generate energy to produce ATP. So what's the total number of NADH and FADH2 that have been produced so far? We've had quite a few. And we're talking from one molecule of glucose. So we have 10 NADH, there were 2 from glycolysis, there were 2 from the bridge reaction, and 6 from the Krebs cycle. So remember that Krebs cycle did 2 turns. We have 2 FADH2 from the Krebs cycle. Again, there was 1 per turn. And then the purpose of these is to carry the energy or the high energy electrons to the electron transport chain so that they can generate ATP when it gets there. So that's going to change the ADP to ATP. All right, so you should have this diagram in your notes, and you're going to, again, label this. You won't be doing a lot of writing, mainly labeling. So we've got our mitochondria. This is our membrane, our cristae membrane in the mitochondria, on those folds. Okay, so one side would be the inside, one side would be the outside. We've got the outer membrane, inner membrane space, and then we've got our cristae. So here's our outer membrane, inner membrane space is here, and then the cristae are these membranes. Okay, then we have our matrix. Our matrix is that inner portion of the mitochondria. So if you need to write that a little bit better to say this is the outside of the mitochondria and this is the inside of the mitochondria, you're more than welcome to make that note too. Make it such that you understand what you're putting down. Okay, so the Krebs cycle is transporting a whole bunch of those electrons. So we've got 10 NADH that came from those different processes that have already been completed. And they're going to basically act as the carrier, dropping those electrons off to the electron transport chain. So we've got 10 NADH turning into NAD+, and 2 FADH2 turning into FAD. And they're dropping off their electrons. You can see our little electrons are popping up along here. They're going to be transported through the electron transport chain. And at the end of the electron transport chain, the electrons and hydrogen are going to be combined with oxygen to form water. So that's where, when we sweat, that's where some of that water is coming from. It's coming from our respiration process. So our oxygen's turning into water. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor. It's essential for getting rid of low energy electrons and hydrogen ions. So as the electrons move down the electron transport chain, they release energy. The energy is used to pump hydrogen protons across the membrane from the matrix to the inner membrane space. So just like with photosynthesis, we've got all of these hydrogens in the matrix. Okay, and they're going to be getting pumped through to the other side. Okay, the electrons are helping, kind of like the electricity to make them pass through. The hydrogen protons are pumped against the concentration gradient from an area of low concentration to the matrix, an area of high concentration. A concentration gradient has now been established, which is then, and then the high concentration of the hydrogen in the inner membrane space and low concentration in the matrix. So higher concentration here, lower concentration here. So that's going to make the cell want to do something about that because it's off, it's not balanced. So also embedded in the mitochondrial membranes are enzymes called ATP synthases. We have the same thing in photosynthesis. And if you remember, synthesis means to make. ATP is talking about what it's making, and the ASE means that it's an enzyme. So hydrogen ions are going to flow through the ATP synthase back to the matrix, the area of low concentration. So remember, with the diffusion and osmosis, we want our higher concentration stuff to go back to the lower concentration to get to equilibrium. The ATP synthase is going to allow that to happen. Our hydrogens are going to pass through here, and in the process, it's going to go ahead and make that. It's going to spin the rotor, which is going to add a phosphate to ADP to form ATP. So it's providing the energy. The energy is going to be stored in this bond and held in the ATP. So this system couples the movement of high energy electrons with the production of ATP. As the high energy electrons move down the electron transport chain, they release the energy. And this energy is used to move the protons. And these ions then rush back across with enough force to make the ATP synthase work and generate lots of ATP. So let's look at what happened as far as our ATP along the way. Glycolysis, we had to use 2 ATP in order to produce 2 NADH. The bridge reaction, we had to use 2 ATP and we ended up producing 4, so we have a net gain of 2 ATP. That's what I meant to mention there. We produced 2 NADH. In the bridge reaction, we produced another 2 NADH. And in the Krebs cycle, we produced 2 ATP, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH2. Now, if each NADH has enough energy to produce 3 ATP, and each FADH2 has enough energy to produce 2 ATP, then I want you to go ahead and calculate how much ATP will 10 NADH produce, and how much will 2 FADH2 produce, using this information up here. So in glycolysis, we have 2 ATP. Krebs cycle, we have 2 ATP. And in the electron transport chain, we end up with 34 ATP for a grand total of 38 for the entire respiration process. Okay, so about 40% of the energy contained in the glucose molecule has been converted to ATP. The remaining 60% is given off as heat. Our diets consist of more than just glucose. Complex carbohydrates like our starches, our breads, are broken into simple sugars like glucose. So we talked about the macromolecules unit where we have the complex carbs, we have the simple sugars. So those are basically all going to be broken down. Lipids and proteins can also be broken down into molecules that enter the Krebs cycle or glycolysis at one of several places. We're not going to get into the depth of how the lipids and proteins get broken down into what gets used in the Krebs cycle or glycolysis. We don't need to get into that. Just know, think about the fact that all of those compounds are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So all you would have to do, think of when we built them, is pull them apart, reconstruct them to make the different molecules you need in order for them to work in the respiration process. The cell can generate ATP from many different fuel types other than glucose. And keep in mind, if you are eating too many sugars, your body is taking those sugars and turning them into fats for storage. So your body will use your carbohydrates first, but then once the carbohydrates are gone, then it's going to start using the lipids and proteins for energy. So think about that as if you're working out trying to build muscle, you need to have some sort of energy to be turned into the muscle. If you don't have it, then it's going to start breaking down your lipids and your protein, or your lipids and your muscle, in order to, because it needs the energy. So if you don't have something that's going to provide energy, you're not going to be able to build the muscle. But yet if you have, but if you do have lipids and proteins, then like the exercising is a way that you can eliminate some of the excess that you don't need. Okay, that's it for